On April 16, 2007, what started as an ordinary Monday morning in Blacksburg, Virginia, quickly turned into one of the deadliest school shootings in American history. 32 people were killed, and 17 more were wounded. The tragedy dominated headlines around the world. 23-year-old Sung-Hee Cho was the man behind the attack. People tried to understand what could have led him to commit such an atrocity like this. As always, one of the biggest discussions that came from it was the influence of violent video games, with news outlets arguing that they could have played a huge role.
You saw a methodology here of chaining the doors, then going calmly. Apparently, this is according to eyewitnesses, there was a flat effect on his face, just as if you were playing a video game.
Now, of course, I'm no psychologist, but when you look into many of these cases, the pattern becomes a lot more complicated than simply blaming video games. Many perpetrators like this had histories of severe isolation and troubled home lives, or serious personal and mental health struggles, or maybe all of it together. There was never really one single cause. But while people were debating whether video games could influence real-world violence, someone was already making a video game about the tragedy itself. Before we talk about who even created this game, it's important to understand how a game like this could even be hosted in the first place. Newgrounds. If you don't know much about Newgrounds, you really just had to be there. It was basically the home of flash games and animations, a place where anyone could upload almost anything. And because of that, it became one of the most bizarre corners of the early internet. One person with a computer and some creativity could instantly become a part of internet culture. Newgrounds was no stranger to edgy content. It had things like Pico's School along with hundreds of other completely censorship-free projects. But VTech Rampage was different. This wasn't a fictional scenario, it was a game based directly on a real tragedy made shortly after it happened. It makes you wonder, who would even create a game like this? Ryan Lamburn, or his online name Pigpen, was a controversial Australian Newgrounds user and flash game developer during the mid-2000s. But before VTech Rampage, Pigpen was just another name in the massive ocean of Newgrounds creators. This site had thousands of developers making games every day, and most of them disappeared into internet history. But Ryan would end up becoming remembered for something very different. He wasn't known for creating a technical masterpiece or a genre-defining game. He became known because he found one of the easiest ways to get attention on the early internet. Make something that people simply couldn't ignore. What not everyone knows though is that VTech Rampage was only the beginning of Pigpen's formula. He seemed to love the outrage and controversy that VTech spawned, and he actually made another game that we'll talk about more later in this video. It was a game called The Slaying of Sandy Hook Elementary School. Released in 2013, it was another flash game based on a real mass shooting. This time, the 2012 attack at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. Like VTech Rampage, both these games put you in the role of the shooter, making them both the most controversial games ever platformed on Newgrounds. If you know anything about Newgrounds, you probably also know about its long-standing anti-censorship policy. For years, the site had a reputation of allowing almost anything. Offensive dark jokes and controversial games were all part of what made Newgrounds, well, Newgrounds. But Pigpen's game simply just went too far. Tom Fulp, the co-founder of Newgrounds, removed The Slaying of Sandy Hook Elementary from the site. That might not sound like a big deal to some people, but it actually marked one of the biggest shifts in Newgrounds history. The obvious question was, why ban this game but leave VTech Rampage up? Interestingly, there was actually a brief period where VTech Rampage was removed from Newgrounds, but not for the reason you might expect. The game wasn't taken down because of the subject matter surrounding it, instead it was removed because of a copyright issue involving the song Shine by Collective Soul, which was used as the game's title track without their permission. The RIAA issued a cease and desist over the use of the song, forcing Ryan Lamburn to eventually remove the track and upload a new version of the game. The reason the song was included in the first place was because it was reportedly a song Sung-Hee Cho listened to frequently, making the game even more controversial than it already was. VTech Rampage was never taken down for the gameplay itself though. Despite the immense political pressure and public outcry, Newgrounds leadership officially announced on May 22, 2007 that they would stand behind the decision to keep the game hosted on their platform, which is pretty expected from them. Newgrounds is basically a monument for early internet culture. As long as it's legal, Newgrounds would host it. I realized while editing this that I left out a really important detail. Pigpen actually asked for money in order for him to delete VTech Rampage, and that's too important to leave out. Yes, VTech Rampage was a game about the same subject matter, But the slaying of Sandy Hook was centered around the murder of very young children, something Newgrounds publicly said crossed a line out of respect for the victims' families. The timing also mattered a lot. By 2013, both the internet and Newgrounds really started to change. The site's absolute stance against censorship had already begun to crumble. This video is mainly about VTech Rampage because it feels like the beginning of Ryan Lambert's descent into becoming the most infamous video game developer. And to be fair, Ryan did bring up some interesting points. He claimed that news outlets were using tragedies to shock and attract people's attention. So how is that really any different from what he was doing? It's a question that made people stop and think. If a headline grabs your attention by covering a horrific event, and a flash game grabs your attention by turning that same event into a game, are they both relying on shock? And I don't think the answer is that simple. One is reporting on a real event, and the other is asking you to participate in a recreation of it. Whether you agree with Ryan's argument or not, it's a debate that followed him throughout his career. In the end, nobody really won except Ryan. He got exactly what he wanted for VTech Rampage. It was a game built almost entirely on shock value, and it did exactly what it was designed to do. People talked about it, and he got publicity from his game. You know what some people say, publicity is publicity, good or bad. School shootings have always been one of the most difficult subjects for video games to touch, and very few developers have ever tried. In 2005, a man named Danny LaDunn released Super Columbine Massacre RPG. It received backlash the moment it dropped, but it wasn't only trying to shock people. The game was meant to criticize the way media turned Columbine into a spectacle, while also being a parody of video games themselves. It was controversial, but the shock content was there to support the message. Shock value can be an incredibly effective storytelling tool when it's used with a purpose. Take the tactical SWAT game Ready or Not, for example. One of its most talked about missions has you respond to a college campus shooting. You might find it disturbing, but the point isn't really to shock you at all. You're there to stop it, and the mission is handled with a level of seriousness and matureness that fits the subject, even if it could be done a little better. Even Pico's school gets misunderstood. Despite the rumors, it isn't based on Columbine. It uses edgy humor and degeneracy as part of its identity. But underneath that is a game with a distinct style and personality that helped define the entire Flash era. My channel probably wouldn't exist without Pico's school. And that's where Ryan really missed the mark with VTech Rampage. It just doesn't have anything to say, it's not making a meaningful statement, and it's not very well made at all even for a solo developer. But Flash game standards have always been pretty low. I'm not saying Pigpen is a horrible person, I don't know him personally, and I'm not going to compare him to the people responsible for the tragedies his games were based on, but I do find it interesting how much of his work was built around the idea of making something that people can't ignore. Obviously the scale is completely different, but there's a strange irony in how some people who commit horrible acts are driven by the same basic idea. Do something people can't ignore, become a name people remember, and create a reaction. In Ryan's case, it was through controversy and shock value, but that desire for attention and notoriety is a disturbing pattern you see in much darker situations. Before we talk about VTech Rampage itself, I'm going to talk about the real tragedy it was based on. If you don't want to hear the full details about that, I completely understand, and feel free to skip this portion of the video. The first shooting happened around 7:15 in the morning at West Ambler Johnston Hall, a student dormitory, where 2 students were killed by a man dual-wielding 2 handguns. At the time, police believed the attack was an isolated incident, and the campus even continued operating while investigators tried to figure out what happened. About 2 hours later, Cho mailed a package to NBC News containing videos, photos, and a written manifesto explaining his thoughts and grievances. Minutes after mailing that package out, he entered Norris Hall, an engineering building on campus, and barricaded the doors before opening fire inside. 30 more students and faculty members were tragically killed before police breached the building. Cho died by suicide as officers entered. Law enforcement and the university faced criticism over the delay in warning students after the first shooting. And this is the tragedy that VTech Rampage attempted to turn into a 5-minute flash game. The game is split into 3 sections, each one loosely based around different parts of the Virginia Tech shooting. The first section takes place on the Virginia Tech campus, where the player walks around trying to reach the first target while avoiding attention from other people nearby. The second section changes the gameplay into more of a stealth sequence. The player has to avoid police searchlights while moving towards the mailbox before eventually making their way inside the Norris Hall. And the final section is where the game attempts to recreate the events inside the Norris Hall. The player barricades the building and is given a short time limit before police arrive, ending the game with the final moments of the attack. The game also had a lot of racist and anti-Semitic remarks, pushing its shock humor even farther. It also featured Lavio Labriscu in the final level, one of the real victims of the Virginia Tech shooting. The player tells him to get in the oven. Having a real victim appear in a game where the player takes the role of an attacker was one of the most disturbing aspects of VTech Rampage. And that's how short it is. So who was the person behind the real events this game attempted to recreate? Long before the attack had even happened, Sung Hee Cho had become a source of concern for people around him. Classmates and others described him as extremely isolated and difficult to communicate with. He avoided direct interaction with others and communicated through writing instead. He was temporarily placed under psychiatric evaluation after making concerning statements and being accused of stalking. Investigations after the shooting revealed that there were multiple points where people had recognized that Cho needed help, but communication failures between different systems meant those warnings did not lead anywhere at all. Obviously, this doesn't excuse what he did in any way. What happened was horrific, and he's responsible for those actions. But it's still important to look at how others saw him before the attack, because understanding the events leading up to the tragedy is part of understanding the tragedy itself. Like I mentioned earlier, Pigpen didn't just stop at VTech Rampage. He just took a different approach when it came to making his 2013 game, The Slaying of Sandy Hook Elementary School. On December 14, 2012, Adam Lanza carried out an attack on Sandy Hook Elementary School, killing 26 people, including 20 children and 6 staff members, before taking his own life. The tragedy shocked the entire country and became one of the most heavily discussed mass shootings in modern American history. Unlike VTech Rampage, this game tried to present itself in a much more serious way. The only similarities it really has is that the game also follows the perspective of Adam Lanza and attempts to recreate the events surrounding the Sandy Hook shooting. The game used a much darker atmosphere, with no music and a more disturbing visual style built around shadowy silhouettes and simple environments. As disturbing as this game is, it has more of an art direction than VTech, which also makes it weirder to play. Pigpen himself even made some of the music for the game. VTech Rampage looks like a meme RPG Maker game, but the Sandy Hook one actually has an interesting art style. It didn't last long, it was only hosted for a few days before the massive backlash basically forced them to shut it down. Pigpen also claimed that his game had a different purpose. He argued that it wasn't just made to shock people like VTech Rampage, but it was meant to be a serious artistic statement and a commentary on gun violence. He even put some audio clips in the game itself explaining why he made it.
Hi, I'm Ryan Jake Lamborn, creator of this game. Back in 2007, I created a game called VTech Rampage about the Virginia Tech shootings. In the years since, I've been routinely asked by fans of VTech to make more games of just about every mass shooting that's gotten media coverage. I'm someone who rarely follows the news, so these updates have been a constant reminder of just how commonplace mass shootings and school shootings have become. I grew up in Houston, Texas, where I remember guns and ammunition being available, in unmanned sections of Walmart, and just it being commonplace to hear gunshots in the distance as I tried to go to sleep.
Whether you agree that's the intention or not, it's clear he was definitely trying to make something different from VTech. The question became whether the game was actually making a statement or it was just relying on the same thing that made his previous work so infamous. At the end of the day, VTech Rampage and the Slaying of Sandy Hook Elementary School are remembered for one reason. They are almost impossible to believe they existed. After all the controversy surrounding his games, Ryan eventually faded out of the spotlight and is kinda just gone now. There wasn't really a comeback or new era for Pigpen. His name became tied almost entirely to these few games and the discussions surrounding them. Newgrounds represented a time when the internet felt completely unfiltered. Anyone could create something, upload it, and potentially have millions of people see it. That freedom created one of the funniest, most creative, and most memorable things from the early internet. But it also created things like this. Games that cross lines most people never thought would be crossed. Games based on real tragedies made by people who wanted a reaction. And as uncomfortable as that is for some people to talk about, that's also part of understanding what the early internet was like. Even years later, these games are still being discussed just because they show how unpredictable that era was. The internet was a place where creativity and controversy existed side by side, and sometimes the same freedom that allowed someone to create something amazing also allowed someone to create something horrific. I actually wish I had included the Slaying of Sandy Hook Elementary in my Creepy Flash Games iceberg, but I didn't even know it existed until researching this video. And honestly, that's one of the strangest things about looking back at old internet culture. Even the most unbelievable stuff remains pretty niche. Like I said earlier, shock value itself isn't always a bad thing. When used correctly, it can make a game memorable, uncomfortable, or even meaningful. In a good way. But when shock becomes the entire purpose, when the goal is only to make people angry or get attention, that's when everything starts to fall apart. And in Pigpen's case, that might have been exactly the point. These were real tragedies that affected real people, and this video is in no way meant to glorify what happened or the people responsible. The reason this story is worth talking about is because of how bizarre it is, and that something like this could even exist in the first place. And that's exactly why it deserves its own video. I hope you enjoyed and have a wonderful day.